So let's begin. And my first question is going to go to Rabbi Wolpe. David, do you expect to go to heaven?
Not tomorrow. That's the old joke about, the good news is that there's baseball in heaven. The bad news is you're pitching Thursday. So what I would say is that part of the problem of the idea of an afterlife is that we tend to make it far more literal than it needs to be, and as a result it starts to seem ridiculous. I mean, before you entered this world, could you have imagined mountains and tuna fish and teeth and ideas and music? Of course not. It is literally unimaginable. But we make of the idea of another world something that we can imagine and understand, and so we reduce it to nonsense. It's Mark Twain in Letters from Earth. He said that people assume when they go to heaven they're going to lie on green fields and listen to harp music. He says you wouldn't want to do it for 5 minutes while you're alive, but you think you'll be happy for the rest of eternity doing it after you die. And the crux of it is, and I suspect really what this evening will come down to, is do you believe that human beings are entirely material? Are you only made of stuff? Or is there something non-physical? Is there something ethereal and eternal about you, about us, some mystery at the heart of this stuff? And if there is, then there's a possibility, that we'll all, I don't want to say go somewhere because that assumes that it's spatial. And again, that's the way people think, and the way we think is not necessarily the way the world is. Our minds are much too limited to grasp it. But I'll just close by saying that I always assumed that human beings were more than stuff. And for me, at least, this came home on an emotional level when a little less than 2 years ago, my father died. And as many of you know, it is a Jewish custom when someone's buried to throw dirt on the grave. And I thought this was going to be extraordinarily difficult, to take a shovel full of dirt and throw it on the coffin of somebody that I loved very dearly. But I actually didn't find it nearly as difficult as I anticipated, and the reason is that I knew that whatever was in that coffin, he wasn't there. But I also knew that that wasn't the same thing as he wasn't. It just meant he wasn't there, but he was, and he is. I just don't know how.
Sam, in The End of Faith, you chide scientists who believe that consciousness ends with death. So picking up a little bit on what David said, you wrote, the place of consciousness in the natural world is very much open to question. The truth is we simply do not know what happens after death. To my mind, this very much leaves the door open for a belief in the afterlife.
Although it doesn't make the traditional beliefs in the afterlife any more plausible. It's not the point I was making there. But it does, that point of not knowing what happens after death is what worries me about this conversation. I've been very worried about this, that all of you have given up a perfectly serviceable Tuesday evening only to hear the four of us tell you every which way that we have no idea what happens after death. Well, I expressed the spirit of my wife, and she was actually able to put me at ease. I'm worried, obviously, about boring all of you, and she said, nothing Hitchens does is ever boring. So I have that going for me. I think we should think about what this concept of the afterlife does. We'll talk about the plausible versions of it, and how implausible some of the traditional ones are. But I think, just to give some context, we're living in a world in which 9 million children every year die before they reach the age of 5. Okay, year after year after year. I mean, that is an Asian-style tsunami of the sort you remember from 2004 every 10 days, killing only children before the age of 5. I mean, think about these children. Think about their parents. Know that virtually all of these parents are people who believe in God and were praying all the while that their children would be saved. And their prayers were not answered. Now, the afterlife comes into the midst of this reality, and as a promise that all of this is going to make sense in the end, that somehow at the end of existence we're going to be all let in on the punchline and have a mighty laugh with Almighty God for eternity. Now, there's no evidence of that, and I think, therefore, this concept of the afterlife really functions as a substitute for wisdom. It functions as a substitute for really absorbing our predicament, which is that everyone is going to die. There are circumstances that are just catastrophically unfair. Evil sometimes wins, and injustice sometimes wins. And the only justice we're going to find in the world is the justice we make. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to absorb this really down to the soles of our feet. And this notion of an afterlife, the happy talk about how it's all going to work out and it's all part of God's plan, is a way of shirking that responsibility. So that's where I am.
Brad, 3 times a day as a religious Jew you would pray the Amidah, where you extol a God who resurrects the dead. It says that right in one of the most standard of Jewish prayers. When you say that, what are you saying? What do you believe you're saying?
So I need to take a couple steps back and make this a running jump rather than a standing jump.
Sure.
As I understand it, rather than simply reducing someone's idea to a caricature, which is easy to do on all sides in this kind of a conversation, we live in an age in which there are different plausible ways of making sense and connecting the dots. One of them is a kind of reductionism in which everything can be explained by its smallest physical components. And once you've explained how inert matter operates, then you create more complex systems, but you've done all your explaining really at the very basic subatomic levels. And that's completely plausible, and you can tell the entire story that way in a reasonable way. I don't think it's the only way one can do it. One can also say that there are intimations all the way down of what others have called, and I think of as mindfulness. And that the mindfulness all the way down emerges at some point into consciousness, which emerges at some point beyond that into something even beyond the consciousness we're aware of. And we have abilities to access it, not necessarily by what we know. And here I have to say, having read the books of the authors here, I agree with almost everything that everyone wrote. People claim knowledge where they can't possibly know. But what I think we can also claim is intuitions that go beyond what we know. Things like hope and trust and loyalty. We ground our lives in them. So there are people who use the afterlife as a way of evading their responsibility. But I know that I and Rabbi Wolpe have sat at the bedside of people who were able to connect with others because this belief inspired them to live each moment with dignity and connection. So for me, the prayer is literally false. Having lived one life with flat feet and fat thighs, I fervently hope that God does not physically resurrect the dead. Although I will tell you, I'm one of the rabbis dancing in Gadi Levi's dance thing, so I expect to have buns of steel by the time you come back for that. But I think it's a metaphor for saying that there is a oneness of which we are an expression, and that does not cease with our death, and that in some very important way, although not one that is reducible to knowledge, I don't claim to know, but I trust that we continue beyond the grave.
Thanks. Christopher, what's wrong with that? If a belief in the afterlife helps one, as Brad said, deal with the inevitability of death, maybe this is a good thing.
Well, then anything that made you feel better would be okay, which I'm sorry to say I think is a contemptible viewpoint. Here's the problem with the afterlife fantasy. It's the same as religion in general. Oh, if you can't hear, I hope it's not my fault. All right, how's that? Okay. Well, not to duck the opening question, give myself a chance to repeat my answer. That would mean that anything that made you feel good or better was fine, which I think is a contemptible position, I'm sorry to say. And it would be as good as drugs, for example. And I don't believe, and in fact Marx never said, that religion is just an opiate. But religion and the afterlife fantasy have these things in common. First, they're man-made. That's very important. They represent claims by humans to be able to interpret the divine and to give themselves power by doing so. We all admit we don't know. That's because we can't know. So the people who have to leave the island right away are those who say they do, who for centuries have tyrannized and still do millions of human beings by claiming to hold the keys of heaven and hell. Leading to my second point, religion is totalitarian in its practice and its theory. It claims to know things it can't know, and it claims to have powers it cannot have. It says if you make the right propitiations and the right donations, you may get paradise, and if you don't, you may get an eternity of pain. That includes, by the way, the souls of unbaptized children of the millions who Sam mentioned. Then there's, I'm afraid to say, but you also, as you'd expect from the man, made the argument of fraud. St. Peter's in Rome was built on the sale of indulgences. That's to say, in return for cash, the promise of a remission of sin and good time in hell or purgatory. There are chantries, actually quite beautiful ones, still all over Europe, still working. Prayers being said for the repose and remission of souls. Pope Benedict, the most reactionary prelate for a considerable time to lead the church, is trying to restore the idea of remission of sin in exchange for donations or other in-kind operations. This is, I'm sorry if it sounds unduly functionalist, but until we've dealt with these questions, we can't have a serious discussion. Now, there's also, I think, a real problem about anything that's eternal. I should probably close with this. It will happen to all of us that at some point you get tapped on the shoulder and told, not just that the party's over, but slightly worse, the party's going on, but you have to leave. and it's going on without you. That's the reflection, I think, that most upsets people about their demise. All right then, because it might make us feel better, let's pretend the opposite. Instead, you'll get tapped on the shoulder and told, great news, this party's going on forever, and you can't leave. You've got to stay. The boss says so, and he also insists that you have a good time. I've read about David's father, and I had a bad time when my own father passed on, but the father proposed by monotheism is the father who doesn't die, who reassures his children, don't worry, I'll never leave you. You'll never see the end of me. You'll never get the chance to feel sorry. I'm always there. I'm the absolute ultimate in dictatorship, and in my courts there's no appeal. Do you really think that this would cheer up anyone of sentience or humanity or capable of feeling of irony? I submit it's out of the question.
I just want to say I was completely with you until the end when you got silly on us. And the reason I say that is because you speak about God in the same way that you would speak about a human dictator as though they were equivalent.
Much worse.
Much worse. But it's only worse. It's only worse because of the eternity of it, right? But the characteristics are the same.
No, the absolutism of it.
The absolutism, the characteristics are the same.
The lack of any appeal.
But that's not.
And the worship of him by his slaves.
Except that that's not at all what any tradition envisions, and even if it did envision it, as you and I think would both agree, the envisioning of traditions of what a God could be are very limited and partial. And so if you want to make it, yes, that it's North Korea forever, then I would say you're belittling the notion of what it means to have a God. You're belittling the notion of what it means to have eternity in, if not bliss, at least reasonable happiness. And it's true that you lose everything in this world, but also it's not at all the case, and you know that it's not the case, that the notion of the afterlife invariably leads to neglect of what is important in this world. Sometimes, in fact, it does the exact opposite. You can take large swaths of belief. You mentioned Marx. Communism, for example, which repudiated the idea of the afterlife and therefore thought you have to create utopia here, and it led it to horrendous misdeeds throughout the 20th century. So the belief in the afterlife can be totalitarian and terrible, but so can the idea that there's nothing after this world and therefore you have to perfect human beings here. It can work both ways.
I wanted to ask you, Christopher, do you really believe that dead is dead? You don't believe in any kind of consciousness going after death? You believe dead is dead?
Okay. The survival of consciousness independent of the brain, which Sam knows more about than I, and we're getting better acquainted with, is quite different from the religious belief in a mandated path by which you can follow or not follow, leading to reward and punishment. Completely different. It's different in the same way as, say, spiritualism was, which wasn't really a religion, but was a very strong, fraudulent movement that not coincidentally flourished after the First World War in the hope of putting people in touch with dead relatives and so forth. Not one single interesting thing ever got said from the other side. Fascinating, you know. Burblings from the beyond, but millions of people pitifully paid attention to it. I guess my answer has to depend on David's point about stuff. We actually know a great deal more than we ever did, than any of our predecessors did, about what stuff we're made of. We know that our DNA gives us enormous amounts in common with other animals, huge amounts. We know that stars had to die. Larry Krauss makes this point very well in his lectures on physics. Stars had to die. One every second blew up, and is still blowing up since the Big Bang. We're made, if you want to call it pretty, from stardust or nuclear waste, depending on your on your analysis. But there's absolutely no reason to think that those molecules will be worth reassembling. That they will rejoin, as do the animals. And as have done the species we didn't know about till recently, the other human tribes, the Cro-Magnons, the Neanderthals, the ones that aren't even mentioned in any holy book, they only died out about 20,000 years ago. Who has heaven and hell for them? It's as likely for us as it is, I think, for any other dog, whale, or bacteria. Well, and no more than that.
Sam, what does it mean when you write that you think that consciousness may indeed survive?
Well, there are many odd ways in which consciousness could survive, and you can make a philosophically respectable argument that consciousness could survive the death of the brain. It's by no means the majority opinion in neuroscience or philosophy that it would. For instance, there's a philosopher at Oxford, Nick Bostrom. This is one of the weirder arguments, but still more plausible than the arguments you get from religion. Nick, there's actually very little you have to assume to make this seem somewhat robust. The argument is called the simulation argument, and he argues that we are all very likely not living in a real universe, but living in a simulated universe. And we are being simulated on the hard drives of computers of the future. Now he gets there with a few simple steps. You simply have to acknowledge that consciousness is at bottom the result of information processing at the level of the brain, and there's nothing magical about brains. It could be information processing in a computer of the future. Most scientists think that's true. They don't think there's anything magical about the wet stuff in our heads. And that consciousness is at some point going to be instantiated in computers. Then you simply have to grant that humans of the future will run simulations of the past in the way that we run simulations, Sims games, and then there's just one short move, that simulated universes, almost by definition, will outnumber real universes. And therefore we are a lot more likely to be among the simulated ancestors than the real ancestors. Now again, this everyone acknowledges it seems a little crazy, but the assumptions that you have to take on board are not so weak. And I would add to this the somewhat disconcerting idea that if in fact we are running as a simulation on a computer of the future, this computer could have been built by Mormons or Scientologists who would want to simulate the truth of their religion. And therefore, all religions could be true in this simulated universe. And we could expect to see Jesus coming back on clouds of glory and moving to Missouri as the Mormons expect. So now all of that sounds completely crazy, but it is not as crazy as the version of the afterlife that is really on offer traditionally, which has been actually neatly sidestepped here because it entails the resurrection of the dead. Most people think that the afterlife religion is offering, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, has something to do with the soul floating off the brain into a tunnel of light and into paradise. But that's actually not the canonical afterlife. The canonical afterlife is God has to do the humble work of reassembling us. And I don't want to take more than my allotted time here, but I think we should talk about just how implausible that vision is, because that actually is the vision of Judaism and Christianity and Islam.
I just want to make one quick addendum. There's also, who I thought you were going to talk about, is Galen Strawson. I mean, another Oxford philosopher who says that consciousness is actually so impossible philosophically to figure out that it must be that it exists even in inanimate matter, even though it doesn't seem that way. So I don't think that it's, but let's leave aside how difficult consciousness is to figure out without some sort of either strange hypothesis or spirit. Yes, it's true that much of Judaism talks about resurrection, much of it talks about afterlife, but there are there's a plurality of voices. And I mean, the Talmud says, for example, you assume that the sages are in paradise, but it is not so. In fact, paradise is in the sages. That's not the sort of voice that generally you hear when the literalist view of an afterlife is attacked. And for more on that, I turn to my colleague, Rabbi Brad Artson.
I would actually love for us all to go out to coffee and leave them aside so that we could say things like, wow, that's really interesting, I haven't thought about that. And what do you do with this? Rather than the scoring of points. And so there's a lot of cleverness and there are a lot of quips. But at the end of it, what it sounds like we're saying is that religion is a monolith, and the worst of religion is compared to the best of science, which is fluid and evolving. And I'm halfway there with you. I think one of the greatnesses of science is its capacity to be self-reflective and its capacity to change convictions. But the wreckage of scientific error is fairly impressive, and the diversity of religious thought is also, I think, undergirded, unfortunately, I think in part because we all had bad religious education as kids and we're still in recovery. So,
but Bradley, I want to accept your challenge, but what do you, I mean, is Maimonides the worst of religion? Maimonides came right out and said you have to believe in the resurrection as a literal
yes, and
truth.
Maimonides also said that what I've written in my book is disguised so that people will, if they need literalism, latch onto it and miss what I'm trying to say. And he also said that we call the world to come because we don't experience it during this lifetime, but eternity exists at the present. And if you attain a right consciousness, you can be in eternity now. So the challenge is, we all come to it with our own different concrete needs, but religion is, I think, far more nuanced. And I guess the plea I would like to offer to you, because the parts of your books, both of you gentlemen, that I agreed with was everything you trashed religion for, it deserves to be trashed for. I have an autistic son, and if I believed in that bully in the sky, I would have to tell Dr. Wexler that I was leaving my employment. But I don't, and I don't think that my tradition or the Buddhist tradition or the richness of Hindu tradition understood in a nuanced and ethical way is any more problematic than science's capacity to learn from its mistakes and to move on. And the way the Bible is used in my community with my students is I would hold up as ethical as anywhere else, and a part of that is the recognition that although we do not know, we hold to hopes that orient us and allow us to value each other as of abiding significance.
Which can be done by anyone who repudiates the supernatural. Look, I don't mind attacking religion at its best if you'd rather I do that. I mean, behind the idea of judgment, remember, which is part of the deal of the afterlife and the reward of heaven or hell, is some rough concept of justice, that there's an equalization of the odds against which we struggled when we were alive, that the tears are dried, and that the wrongdoing is punished. Very, very old wellspring of human aspiration. Why do the wicked prosper? I would really like to know. And why, as Hamlet says, so much contumely is heaped on the patient and the meek. Now, the reason why Sam's Oxonian friend disturbs us when he elaborates his theory is we don't like to think that we're just digitized by someone else's brain, that we're rats in some maze, someone else's maze. Nor, though, rather interestingly, do we like to think that everything that happens to us is random. We repudiate both ideas. They're both equally distressing. But the reason why I started with my totalitarian point is this. Take the case that I still can't get out of my mind. You remember reading about it. The woman in Austria who was kept in a cellar by her father for 30 years and raped every day and bore him children who he raped also. Picture how she must have prayed, how she must have wearied heaven with her prayers, and how accidental was her release that we even know about. You're told those tears will be dry, that will be compensated. In other words, that has to mean her suffering was part of the plan. We let that happen. Yes, we did know. We do take responsibility. That was part of the design, but it'll be better later. I think that makes her suffering meaningless, and in fact rather obscene. We'll do that to her, but we'll make it up later on. Take another great Austrian, now deceased, born in Braunau on the Inn, and dead in May, I think, 1945. Yes, that was all part of the plan too, but believe me, we'll see to it that he's punished for it. Now, if you don't mind my saying so, Rabbi, that kind of thinking seems to me to materialize both the worst in the concept, the horrible idea of the human being as an experimental object in a design that's opaque to us, where we're played with, and to maximize the horror of randomness. To pick one Austrian, make him very nearly the ruler of the whole of Europe, another Austrian, and keep her as a prisoner of her rapist father for 3 decades. And that's all part of the plan too. So it's maximizing chaos, and it's maximizing tyranny and deliberate cruelty. And that's why I think reason has to repudiate this whole means of thinking. Reason and justice too, I should add.
As I'm sure it would if religion thought that way, but it doesn't, in fact.
Wait a minute.
No, wait.
Dave, I'll give you your time here, please.
Okay.
That's the move that's really not open to you. If you want to change the subject to a truly purified wisdom tradition that is non-dogmatic, that's just open to mystery, you have to...
No, I'm not going to do that.
Okay, but if you want to follow the path...
You have to hear the move before you repudiate.
No, but I think you're taking the move that Bradley
was making. You think so, but I might not be.
Well, let me just tell you what I heard you do.
Okay, go ahead.
You just said religion is not the way Christopher suggested it was, and in the vast majority of cases, it is. And so you have to at least admit that we're not caricaturing religion. 50% of Americans think they're going to see their pets in heaven. I mean, we're dealing with
heaven if you don't.
Right. We're having this conversation in the context of how religion is practiced.
Soon?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
There are strains of religion that are deterministic and say that everything that happens in the world is a plan. There are. Calvinism, for example, does that. In Judaism, that's actually very rare. There are a couple of notable thinkers who say that, but almost no notable Jewish thinker believes that what happens here is preordained by God. And in fact, free will and the free will to do horrendous things is built into the system and is the prerequisite of the chance of human beings to both sin and also to do wonderful things. So when you say that God made this man do this, that's all part of the plan, and she's going to be rewarded in the afterlife for the horror that God inflicted on her here, I can, with all good conscience, say, look, I'm not going to speak for the pet envisioning Christians that you speak for, but I will speak certainly for my own tradition and say that that's not actually what Judaism believes. It's not what almost any major Jewish thinker says, and I wouldn't believe it if it did say that. So
okay,
that's
a great cafeteria to be shopping at. Take your pick.
What do you mean, take your pick? I just said that almost no major Jewish thinker says that, and if they did, I wouldn't agree with them.
Both of you, confronted with Sam's perfectly clear attribution of the words of the Rambam, you said, well, it's as likely that paradise is in the sages as the sages are in paradise.
I didn't say it, the Talmud did.
Yes, all right, the Talmud says. And your colleague says, Maimonides writes in order to be misunderstood, and it's deliberately, which is, by the way, I quite agree with the Straussian reading of him that says that that is so. But this is a guide to the perplexed. What you're saying is he wants to intensify perplexity.
Welcome to Judaism.
Yes. He also, look, when you say, for example,
you have this smorgasbord of options,
let me give you a little sample of how Rambam thinks. When it says, for example, in Isaiah that the lion will lay down with the lamb, right? And you know Woody Allen's line that the lion will lay down with the lamb, but one of them won't get much sleep. So,
no, the lamb, actually.
So Rambam says this is not to be understood literally. It means big nations and small nations will dwell together in amity, and you should not think that the order of nature will be overturned. Now, I didn't invent that. It's right there. I can show it. It's the end of Malachim. It's the end of the code of law. And he has a sophisticated understanding of religion. If you say to me, are there people with an unsophisticated understanding of religion? I have no doubt that there are. I even know a few. But you're not sitting with them on a stage. And I don't think it's actually, I don't understand my task to be to defend understandings of religion that I don't adhere to. So I'm happy to argue with you what I understand about religion, but obviously, if I thought mainstream Christianity was the way to understand religion, I'd be a mainstream Christian. Right. And I'm not.
Well, I want to make 2 points in response. I just want to kind of show you all how the sausage of faith gets made. Or at least argued for. I see 2 problems with what you just did, and perhaps you're aware of them. One is that Maimonides actually said that this could not be understood allegorically or in any other way, but literally he came back 25 years later after he had been misunderstood in the Guide to the Perplexed and wrote, I think in his commentary to the Mishnah, that the resurrection is a literal truth, has to be believed in. There may be some caveats there in his theology, but he was talking about bodies being reanimated. The other issue is you made this sort of artful move to the free will loophole. You said people have free will. If a man wants to lock his daughter in a dungeon and have sex with her, God has allowed that because he's given us this rather diabolical freedom. That doesn't cover all of the other suffering for which only God can be responsible if he exists. The 9 million children I just talked about dying every year through cancers and violence and accidents and lack of access to clean water. And this is God's fault if God exists. I mean, either he can do nothing about this, or he doesn't care to. So either he's impotent or evil. I mean, this is the problem that the free will doesn't get you out of.
David and Brad, I wanted to pick up on that point in the context of this afterlife issue, which is, if you believe in a just God, how could you not believe in a world to come where the good receive benefits and the evil are punished?
Look, the challenge here is everyone has great clarity in the God they don't believe in. And I don't believe in that God either. Right? So,
Well, then what's God? So how do you tell us how you understand gratuitous misfortune visited upon the innocent?
Like being in a debate like this.
Oh. My condolences.
Not forgiven. So, look. This is a talk I give to first-year rabbinical students and congregations all over the country. It is a medieval mistake based on Aristotelian thought that God has to be a simple, unmoved mover, and thereby eternal, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. Right? Those are terms that don't exist in biblical or in rabbinic Hebrew. So I apologize for the way the philosophers kidnapped the traditions, but it's not in the Torah. There is no Hebrew word for omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, and the concept is a nonsense concept.
So you're saying God doesn't have the power to change these things?
Yes, of course that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that what God has is a different kind of power than the power of the dictator that Christopher Hitchens and I both despise. And that what I look to God to be is a persuasive power, more comparable to a teacher or a lover or a parent, who teaches and inspires you to be the best by seeing your potential and by giving you the vision and the power to rise to it. But I don't believe in a God who breaks the rules or who can intervene or who can do magic. And the challenge here, wait, may I just say one more thing before you leap on me?
Sure.
It is the 125th anniversary of the birthday of Alfred North Whitehead, my Rebbe. And so in his honor, I tell you the following Hasidic story. The story is told of the Kutzker Rebbe, one of the great masters of the Hasidic tradition, who, walking past someone's home, sees that they're so impoverished they don't have the capacity to have a Shabbat meal. And so he prays for her to have a Shabbat meal magically bestowed upon her. I mean this only metaphorically. And no actual chassid involved in the story itself. So he prays that she should have this miraculous Shabbat dinner given to her, and she does, and he hears a vision which says, because you've intervened in the affairs of this world, you've lost your place in the world to come. And he starts to dance. And he says, when his students question him, he says, for the first time, I'm able to serve God without expectation of reward. That's in mainstream rabbinic tradition. So often I had the sense that what's being criticized is a kind of ignorant abuse of religious nuance, and we certainly know anyone who's been in an airport has read self-help books that claim to use scientific findings to justify all kinds of stupidities, which I don't think you can hold science responsible for, even though probably numerically there are far more people who have nonsense ideas based on false science as they do in religion. The challenge here is you say it's man-made, and I agree. It is man-made, as is medicine, as is law, but the solution to bad medicine and bad law is not to get rid of it. The solution is to have open discussions and continue to refine it and surpass it. Christopher.
There's a story I was told, not unlike that, but a Roman Catholic priest actually could really be any Christian. There's a comparable. This is not my fault.
Just hold the mic. Hold the mic. Yeah.
Okay. There's a comparable story I was told about the death of I think it was a Roman Catholic priest, but it could be any Christian official, really, who gets to St. Peter's Gate and is told, well, you're well done, thou good and faithful servant. Here's your place we've been preparing for you in paradise. And he says to St. Peter, but I see that there's terrible suffering and deprivation and misery among the souls in hell. Surely my place is with them, ministering to them. And he's told, you really don't get it, do you? One of the reasons why I like doing this, some people say sometimes, don't I ever get tired of debating with the religious? No, absolutely I don't, because you never know what they're going to say next. Sam and I don't mind being called predictable. It's very easy. We know what we think. We say straight out where we think we know and where we think it's not possible to know, why we don't think there's a supernatural, and so on. But this evening already we've had your suggestion that God is only really a guru, a friend when you're in need. I mean, he wouldn't do anything like bugger around with Job to prove a point. And which, if I now tell you, well, that must mean that that book is not the Word of God, you'd say, well, whoever believed that ever was the Word of God? Let me just tell you something. For hundreds and thousands of years, this kind of discussion would have been in most places impossible to have, or Sam and I would have been having it at the risk of our lives. Religion now comes to us in this smiley face, ingratiating way, because it's had to give so much ground, and because we know so much more. But you've no right to forget the way it behaved when it was strong, and when it really did believe that it had God on its side.
You know, I just want to say so much of this is the frisson of the rebel, and I just want to read you these two sentences. It's nonsense to pretend, for instance, that at this date there's something daring and original in proclaiming yourself an anarchist, an atheist. The daring thing, or at any rate the unfashionable thing, is to believe in God. That was 2002, Christopher Hitchens, in a review of Yves Lenoir and George Orwell. And I think that there's some truth to that. It actually is very difficult to argue God in the public square these days.
Since Spinoza, yes.
What's that?
Since Spinoza, yes.
Since Spinoza, yes. Actually, since Hitchens and Harris. But despite the fact that there's no question, there is no question, as has been not only pointed out but easily admitted, that religious thinkers in the 21st century don't actually, if they have good sense, pronounce identical nostrums to religious thinkers in the 2nd century, even though they may use much of the material to explain what they believe. The dilemmas and the essential answers are the same. And the dilemma that we're facing is the extraordinarily difficult realization that when you die, you lose everything. And that's always been true. And everyone has always faced that. And that's, have time for a really short poem?
Yeah.
Hausman, A.E. Hausman, has this kid standing in the town square. He says, "Good people, do you love your lives and have you ears for sense? Here is a knife like other knives that cost me 18 pence. I need but plunge it in my heart, and down will come the sky, and earth's foundations will depart, and all you folk will die." Right? It's like you lose everything when you die. And that's always been the case. And religion, in one sense, has always realized that, which is why you get, especially in, I'll speak about my own tradition, a tremendous emphasis on making this world better. Which is why you can't build a community without what we would call essentially a welfare state in any Jewish community in the world. Because the understanding is there will always be suffering, there will always be pain, and it's the human job to ameliorate that. We're actually taking the discussion a little bit to a different level, to the consternation of some of my discussion partners, which is to say, look, you all know, for example, let's think about this not as biologists but as physicists. You all know that there's this idea in physics of multiple universes. That is, that right now, there is a universe, or many of them, that parallel our own, with maybe slight differences, like maybe there's a universe where Rabbi Artson and I are winning. But other than that, there are these multiple universes. Now, in a world in which it is possible to assume that there are multiple universes that go on at the same time, is it not possible to believe that there are multiple lives for human beings that live in this universe? That's actually, despite the fact that I know you have many problems with religious history and religious doctrine, that's the question we were asked tonight. Is it possible that there's an afterlife? And both from a scientific point of view and from a religious point of view, our affirmation is that it is possible. It's not certain. We don't know what the afterlife is, but it is possible. And if you come out of this discussion opening your mind to the possibility that this world is not all, then we will have won.
David, I want to push you on that, because this was actually my first question to you. What do you see that afterlife as?
My answer.
Jewish tradition talks about reincarnation. It talks about
it does.
Gilgul,
But the Jewish tradition also is deliberately agnostic about the nature of it. So it offers you images. It offers you Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, about which there's almost no description in the Bible. It says Yeshiva Shamala, that is, you get to study Talmud with God. As one of my Talmud teachers once said, for some people it's heaven, for some people it's hell. But the point is that you know, it's like what Chekhov said. Chekhov said that you only get multiple treatments for a disease when there's no cure for the disease, right? If there's a cure, you got one treatment. You only get multiple images of the afterlife if you don't know what the afterlife is. And at least in the Jewish tradition, no one was so foolish as to be dogmatic and say, this is what the afterlife looks like. I'll rest with what Nabokov has John Shade say in Pale Fire. He says, life is such a surprise, why should death be any less of one?
No, it's very attractive as well as clever what David is trying to do. Saying that it's very attractive as well as very clever what David's trying to do. He's saying
you could stop there.
That the most saying that it's those of us who doubt the supernatural who have the failure of imagination. And good move. But there's no one who can't play this game. There could be an afterlife and no God. Why not? There could be many gods and no afterlife. There could be a God with a sense of humor where good people went to hell and evil people and evil people carried on as in his initial creation, ruling the roost. I'm willing to imagine, as Princess Leia says in Star Wars. I can quote literature and scripture too. She wants to borrow Harrison's starship, and he's reluctant, and her envoy says, she's prepared to offer you more money than you can imagine. And he says, well, I can imagine quite a lot. I can imagine quite a lot too, but here's what we're meant to discuss, I think. Those who have claimed to know in advance the rules of reward and punishment, and the actual details of the afterlife, people who actually have and continue to rule the mental lives of millions of people, who have to explain away things like Sam's 9 million dead children by saying, well, what happens to their souls? St. Augustine has to come up with an answer. He says they go to limbo. At least if they're not baptized Catholic, that's where they go. So millions of people for hundreds of years thought that's where their children were. A terrible form of sadism and mental serfdom that the church is now considering dropping. But that limbo was really real to people when it was imagined for them by a sadistic North African pseudo-intellectual. So it's not a failure of imagination to say that this use of imagination is perverse. Neither Sam nor I have said it's impossible that there be a post-life existence. We've just said that it's not knowable, not that it's not known. So surely the default position must be that it's those who have ever said that resurrection or an afterlife is a dogma who have the explaining to do. For myself, I'm very open to that. I like surprises.
Brad.
I find myself once again agreeing with everything that Christopher Hitchens said, except
you thought I was clever too?
Except for 1%.
Except for 1%.
And for me, the main reason for an afterlife is frankly not to bring justice about in this world, but I won't have time in this lifetime to read as much as David Wolpe. And I would like to read some of the references that he's able to spit out all the time in such a learned way. Look, you talk about being at a cafeteria, and it does feel to me like we're using a stacked deck. So what religion says in the 2nd century is grist for the mill, and what science said in the 2nd century is, of course, outmoded. And so chronologically, there's this monolith called religion, and then science is only responsible for right now. But even right now, there are credible physicists who are teaching in universities who teach this theory of multiverse, and there are people like Sean Carroll at Cal Poly who say, that's not science. You can't prove it. You can't disprove it. So that's nonsense masquerading as science. You can't prove or disprove dark matter or dark energy, but it does make the theory work, right? You can't get quantum gravity to fit with relativity, but they work in their own. So the challenge here is, it's a violation, I think, of accuracy to claim that what science does is only affirm what is verifiable or falsifiable. Much of science does that, and it's a very important corrective tool, as I believe it is in most religion today, which is you make a claim, you put it out there, you argue about it, you debate it. But it's not as though these are in opposite camps. So the last thing I want to just state a dissent from is I don't believe that it's that religion lost because science won, because many of the people who have given us the Enlightenment and science were themselves motivated by a desire to read God's text, which is the world. So is there a lot of nonsense that is proposed in the name of religion? For sure. Is it egregious? Absolutely. Every criticism you've made, I think, is despicable and accurate and dead on. But that doesn't taint religion as a whole any more than the notion that you can measure people's craniums and look at their racial feature and then put up a hierarchy of human mattering, which was tenured at Harvard University within the past century, discredits science as a whole. There is every human enterprise that is capable of egregious mistake and of brilliant insight. The last thing I want to say, really the last thing for now, is if you insist on reading Shakespeare literally, then he also would be a dunce, but you would have missed his greatness. And some of the greatest literature in the world, billions of people have thought, were religious literature. I find very inspiring much of religious literature, and I find deeply offensive much of religious literature. But it's literature made by people to make sense of the world and to chart lives of meaning and of value. I think that's good.
Can I...